Hello, I'm Robin Worley, welcome to Lenscraft. Today we're looking at composition. We're going to be looking at some example images showing what works well and what doesn't, but I'm also going to be talking about some of the things we can do to fix problems. It's worth remembering that composition is a skill and takes time to develop. Like most skills, if you don't intentionally practice it, it's going to become weaker. What I want you to do is forget about all the rules you've learned about composition. Forget about trying to fit in with often conflicting advice and rules from other people. Instead, I want you to create a composition that you like and that you like the look of. And whilst you're doing this, I want you to use the 5 tips from this video to improve your results. But before we start, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. Okay, let's get into the first lesson. Photographers often think about composition as being an arrangement of physical objects within the frame. There is an element of this, but not everything you need to arrange is a physical object, like a tree or a bench. In this first image, the composition is created by arranging the areas of light and colour in the frame. These are what draw the eye and hold it in the frame. In this second image, there's little in the way of physical objects, but the image still works. Again, it's the areas of light and contrast that make the image interesting. When you're composing an image, you need to arrange the physical objects, yes, but you also need to consider how the colours and light in the scene become almost imaginary objects that also draw the eye and keep your attention. What's critical to a pleasing composition is how the eye travels around the frame. It needs an easy path of travel, and it shouldn't be darting around and unable to settle on anything. One of the main factors affecting this is light and dark. At a basic level, light areas of the scene attract and hold our attention, but the eyes wander away from the dark areas. Keep this in mind when you're creating your compositions. As a simple rule of thumb, the greater the area an object occupies in the frame, the more importance it gains in the image. When you spot a photo opportunity, it's because something's caught your attention. Once you've captured it as a photograph, the interesting part may not be as obvious as you thought it was, and you need to check this. Take the example of the boats on this lake at sunset. I shot this image because I was attracted to the light on the boats, and that's very interesting, but the sky itself is pretty boring and uninspiring. What we need to do is for these boats to take up more space in the frame, because at the moment they don't take up a lot, and we also need the sky to take up much less. Here's an alternative composition that does this. It's using a slightly wider angle lens, but it's only a 19mm rather than 22mm. But because I've actually taken the camera and tilted it down, I can move in closer to the boats, and that's allowing me to fill the frame with the boats as foreground interest. It's giving them much more visual weight in the photograph, and their importance becomes quite obvious to the viewer. At the same time, I've placed the horizon higher in the frame, which cuts out a lot of the sky, and it shows that that's not really an important part of the scene, but it does add to it. Here's another example. Again, the important element here is the boats and the mist rising off the lake, but it's being diminished by the sky. Now if we crop out just a small portion of the sky, we're going to get the boats and the mist becoming more important. Here's what I mean. So this is a very small change, but it's dramatically changed the feeling of the image, and you can now see what attracted me to the scene much more clearly than the previous image, where the sky had a large area that wasn't creating or adding anything to the image. Let's move on and have a look at the next tip. Another common compositional problem is including too much in the frame. This can detract from the main point of interest, which then becomes lost in the overall image. It can confuse your eye and lose the viewer's attention because the eye doesn't know what to settle on. In this scene, I've used a slightly longer lens to concentrate on just 3 elements. We've got the grass in the foreground water, the tree in the background, and then the light breaking through in the mist and also being reflected. There was actually a lot of other clutter around the area, but I managed to simplify the elements in the frame by using a slightly longer lens. When you're composing a scene, you need to look hard to see what elements add to the image and what detract from it. Think about how you can then cut out the unwanted elements from the frame by changing your camera position or using a lens with a different focal length. In this next image, there was lots of clutter around the sides of the cliffs, and also there was open water in the foreground. Because I used a longer lens again, I was able to concentrate the area of interest and hold the viewer's attention, leading them through the frame. Learning to use the different focal lengths of your lenses and lens characteristics is key to being able to create this simplified view of a scene. These are the tools that allow you to create really compelling compositions, and you need to use them. Let's move on and take a look at tip 4. It's very easy for elements to creep into the edges of a frame without you realising. When we're taking a photograph, we tend not to see these because we're so concentrated on the main point of the scene. When we see the photograph later, they become pretty obvious and become distractions. An object at the edge of the frame will often pull your eye away from the intended point of interest, as in this example. Here we see the wheel in the distance and its reflection are competing with the main subject of the cityscape. They keep drawing your eye away from and out of the main part of the frame. What's happening is that you're trying to hold your attention in 2 areas simultaneously, and you just can't do it. By changing the composition or cropping the frame differently, we can remove the distraction of the wheel. Now the image feels much more balanced and your eye can explore it without getting distracted by the wheel. You need to be sure to check around the edges of the frame for distractions before you take every shot. Let's have a look at our 5th and final tip. We've already mentioned a few times that we should lead the viewer's eye through the frame and avoid distractions. One way we can do this is with leading lines and also having a focal point in an image. Leading lines and focal points work because our brains are wired to try to create order out of chaos. Every time we look at a collection of objects, we start searching for patterns. If a pattern isn't obvious in the frame, then the frame just looks jumbled to us. In this example, it's the gaps between the rocks that create the leading lines. And the leading lines are moving from the foreground backwards into the frame, and they're drawing our attention towards the focal point of the tree. If we also bring in some of the other tips from this video, we can see that the composition has been simplified. There's nothing around the edge of the frame to distract your attention. In this next example, we have a strong leading line in the foreground stream, but the composition doesn't work as well because of a few problems. First, the focal point of the boat is lost because of the angle of view is too wide. This is making the boat too small in the frame so we can't see it easily. It would have been better if we'd turned the camera on its side and used a vertical composition. This would have allowed us to use a longer focal length, which would have made the boat more obvious. The boat's also white, which causes it to become lost in the bright area of the reflected light. When you include a focal point in the frame, make sure it's obvious. Another problem is the amazing sky. It's just competing with the foreground. This is causing your attention to be drawn immediately away from the leading line, rather than being drawn gradually through the frame. Finally, the edges of the frame are just too light, and that again is drawing your eye away from the leading line and also from the focal point. We could have easily fixed these things by adding a strong vignette around the frame. In this final image of Thor's well, the composition works much better. The prominence of the blowhole in the lower centre of the frame makes it obvious what the intention is of this image, and it also holds your attention. At the same time, there's a feeling of depth to the image which moves your eye from the front of the blowhole to the back of the blowhole and then onwards to the incoming wave. Now, by cutting out the sky, your eye is prevented from settling on a large area of empty or negative space that would have been at the top of the frame. We've now covered 5 compositional tips you can focus on when shooting landscapes, but I want to mention one more thing. As we've been discussing the various photos, I've mentioned a couple of things that you can do in editing to correct problems. Cropping an image or adding a vignette are just a couple of examples of this. Often we get into editing our photos and it's easy to forget about the composition that we tried to create. Whilst you're not going to be able to turn a rubbish photo into a masterpiece by editing, you can improve it and correct problems by considering composition. In this image, the composition was okay, but it's been enhanced by dodging and burning. The area around the rock has been lightened to make the rock more prominent and then draws your eye. The wave in the foreground's also been lightened and it's created leading lines with this. The rock was then enhanced using contrast and texture adjustments to make it prominent, and there's also been a faint vignette added around the edge of the frame to help hold in your attention. This is just one example, but it should emphasise that you need to consider composition during editing. And with that, I have a question for you. Do you want to see a follow-up video showing how to incorporate composition into photo editing? If you do, just leave me a comment below to let me know and I'll get to work on it. I'm Robin Worley, you've been watching Lenscraft. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you enjoyed the video, give it a thumbs up and please share it with others. See you next week.